Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be presenting the second of our two-part series about the 1988 murder of Barbara Jean Horn. I first became familiar with this case when it was featured on Unsolved Mysteries only 4 months after the crime originally took place, but since it eventually evolved into a very convoluted story which has dragged on for over 36 years now, I decided to cover it in a two-part episode. We released part 1 last week, which outlined the most important facts of the case, and if you haven't heard the episode yet, I suggest you go back and listen to it, since I'm going to be discussing a lot of the information I previously shared, as well as provide my own theories and analysis. So as a brief recap, 4-year-old Barbara Jean Horn lived with her mother and stepfather in the Castor Gardens neighborhood of Philadelphia when she was presumably abducted from her front yard on the afternoon of July the 12th, 1988. A few hours later, Barbara Jean's nude body was found inside a cardboard TV box on a curb only a block and a half from her residence. It was initially assumed that Barbara Jean was fatally bludgeoned with a blunt object, but in recent years, experts have reached the conclusion that her cause of death was probably asphyxiation. 5 witnesses had seen an unidentified man carrying the TV box through the neighborhood before it was dropped off, but it would not be until 1992 when a 27-year-old suspect named Walter Ogrod was charged with Barbara Jean's murder after he made a full confession. However, Walter quickly recanted his confession as he suffered from developmental disabilities and had been awake for at least 30 hours prior to his interrogation, so he claimed that detectives wore him down and coerced him into admitting to something he didn't do. At his first trial, Walter came within seconds of being acquitted after one of the jurors changed his not guilty vote at the very last second, just as the foreman was about to read the verdict. After a mistrial was declared, Walter went back to court a few years later, but this time he was found guilty and sentenced to death. However, journalist Tom Lowenstein would perform a new independent investigation into the case, which turned up a lot of troubling issues, such as the fact that Walter's conviction was made possible when a pair of jailhouse informants invented a false story about him confessing to Barbara Jean's murder while they were incarcerated. Due to the controversy surrounding the case, the Conviction Integrity Unit of the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office agreed to take a fresh look at it and perform some new DNA testing. In 2020, they released a report outlining all the major problems with Walter's conviction and reached the conclusion that he was likely innocent, so he would be released from death row after serving 28 years behind bars for a crime he did not commit. And unfortunately, even though a couple of potential alternate suspects have popped up on the radar over the years, we still don't know who was actually responsible for killing Barbara Jean. On this episode, we're going to analyze this case and explore all the things which went horribly wrong, as it turned out Walter's story was not an anomaly for the city of Philadelphia during this time period. The detectives who put Walter away have been implicated in some other wrongful conviction cases, which we're also going to discuss. So without any further ado, I now present part 2 of our series about the murder of Barbara Jean Horn. So in our last episode, I talked about how ironic it was that the original Unsolved Mysteries segment about Barbara Jean Horn's murder was only 2 minutes long, yet it turned out to be one of the most complicated cases ever featured on the show. The original segment does not feature any reenactments, but is rather just an on-camera interview with Robert Stack and the lead investigator at the time, Lieutenant Arthur Durant, who shared all the facts about the case, as well as a composite sketch of the unidentified man seen carrying the TV box that contained Barbara Jean's body. Like I mentioned earlier, This aired only 4 months after the crime took place, so I think the Philadelphia Police Department wanted to give the story some national exposure and probably figured it was only a matter of time before the killer was identified and brought to justice. I can't remember when I first learned about Walter Ogrod being charged, convicted, and sentenced to death for the murder years later, but I didn't really have any inkling that this might have been a wrongful conviction until I watched the episode of the true crime series Death Row Stories, which was entitled Snitch Work and first aired in 2018. That's when I realized that this case was seriously messed up, so it was nice to see Walter eventually get exonerated and released from death row. Incidentally, this is the third case from the first season of Unsolved Mysteries which wound up being solved, but reverted back to being unsolved again after the alleged perpetrator's conviction was overturned. The first example of this was the 1982 murder of Doreen Pickard and attempted murder of Susan Laferte, where a suspect named Raymond Beaver Tempest was charged and convicted of the crime before his conviction was vacated in 2015. Since Tempest elected to take an Alford plea rather than go on trial again, there's still ambiguity about whether or not he was wrongly convicted, but the other two Unsolved Mysteries cases have ended with full-fledged exonerations. In addition to this case, the other example of this was the 1985 murders of Harold and Thelma Swain, as a suspect named Dennis Perry was charged and convicted of the crime before his conviction was overturned, and he was released from prison in 2020, just a month and a half after the same thing happened to Walter. In fact, the main reason I decided to tackle Barbara Jean Horn's case right now is because just 1 month before this episode's release, an alternate suspect named Eric Spar was finally arrested for the Swain murders. So perhaps history will repeat itself, and Barbara Jean's real killer will finally be brought to justice in the near future. Now that I performed a deep dive into the story, I can say without hesitation that it is one of the most egregious miscarriages of justice we've ever featured on The Trail Went Cold. What's truly ironic is that Tom Lowenstein, the journalist who brought all the issues with this case to the surface, was not seeking out an innocent person to save from death row. If anything, he used to believe the justice system was too lenient on offenders, since he had watched his father's murderer become a free man after pleading not guilty by reason of insanity. I'm sure Lowenstein had no desire to see an accused child murderer walk out of prison, but he ultimately reached the conclusion that a major injustice had taken place here. I've seen countless cases in which an innocent person was railroaded into falsely confessing to a crime they did not commit, and this was no exception, as it seemed like Walter Ogrod's confession was the brunt of the entire case against him, even though it seemed to contradict other evidence. It's not uncommon for these false confessions to come about after the defendant has gone without sleep for a lengthy period of time and past the point of exhaustion. Walter had been awake for 30 consecutive hours before his interrogation session even started, and when he asked detectives Marty Devlin and Paul Worrell if he could get some sleep first, they said no. In retrospect, they knew exactly what they were doing. I mentioned in our last episode that at the time, the city of Philadelphia had a 6-hour rule, which stipulated that a suspect could only be interrogated for a maximum of 6 consecutive hours. It's obvious that Walter was interrogated for much longer than that, but the two detectives found a loophole by stating that he was only being questioned as a quote-unquote informational witness, and they did not consider him to be a suspect until after he suddenly got emotional and confessed to the crime. Devlin and Worrell always insisted that Walter's confession had to be legitimate because he volunteered information about the murder weapon being a metal pull-down bar from a weight machine in his basement, which he could not have known unless he was the perpetrator. Well, the problem is that even though the two detectives denied this, Walter's landlord, Howard Serrata, claimed that 3 days before the interrogation even took place, they randomly asked him if Walter owned a weight set. If Serrata is telling the truth, then this goes completely against the narrative that Devlin and Worrell had no idea what the murder weapon was until Walter just blurted it out. We know that the unrelated murder of Maureen Dunn took place in Walter's basement in 1986, and since she was the daughter of a police detective, and this was a pretty high-profile case for the Philadelphia PD, there's a good chance that Devlin and Worrell would have seen the original crime scene photos, which showed a weight machine in the background. The fact of the matter is that 3.5 years had passed since Barbara Jean's murder, and the Philadelphia PD were facing great pressure to solve it. The implication seems to be that Devlin and Worrell had already decided that Walter was going to be their fall guy and were brainstorming a scenario where he killed Barbara Jean in his basement, as they already knew what the location looked like from the crime scene photos in the Dunn case. It seems obvious that by the time they spoke to Serrata, they were already considering the possibility of having the weight machine's pull-down bar be the murder weapon and Walter's fabricated statement, even though they didn't match Barbara Jean's injuries, and it would turn out that she was likely asphyxiated rather than bludgeoned to death. But I can understand why they felt Walter would be an ideal fall guy, as his former house had since been boarded up and condemned, so that would provide an explanation for why they were unable to turn up any physical evidence against him. And given that key items such as the murder weapon and Barbara Jean's clothing were never found, it's very odd that the police never even bothered to search the apartment where Walter lived at the time of his arrest to see if they could find other potential evidence to support his confession. You may think I'm throwing around unjust accusations towards Devlin and Worrell, but later on, I'll talk about some other cases they worked on where they displayed this same pattern of behavior. According to Tom Lowenstein, he began to question the validity of Walter's confession when he went to visit him in prison and heard him speak with a robotic, matter-of-fact style that had virtually no resemblance to the emotional 16-page statement he had signed during his interrogation. The statement was in Devlin's handwriting, but he maintained that it was an exact transcription of what Walter said to him. Well, years later, when Devlin had to give a deposition in another wrongful conviction lawsuit he was involved in, he was asked to make a handwritten transcription of a recorded statement that was played for him, and it was obvious that he could not write fast enough to keep up with it. This meant that Devlin likely prepared Walter's so-called confession himself and then asked Walter to sign it. Many innocent people who falsely confess often have low IQs or are easily manipulated and bullied. It's never been reported what Walter's exact IQ is, but even though he was high-functioning and able to take care of himself, he also likely had autism spectrum disorder, which was not diagnosed that often during the 1980s and early 1990s. So Walter definitely fit the personality of someone who could be coerced into confessing to a crime he did not commit. In addition to false confessions, mistaken eyewitness identification has always been cited as one of the biggest causes of wrongful convictions. But the truly ironic thing in this case is that we had 5 witnesses who likely saw Barbara Jean's killer carrying the TV box containing her body, and none of them identified this man as Walter. In many trials, prosecutors will try to convince juries to take eyewitness testimony as gospel, but here, the exact opposite occurred, as the Commonwealth did everything they could to downplay the reliability of the sightings of the man with the TV box, as well as the composite sketch of him, because it went against their narrative of Walter being the perpetrator. This is why Peter Vargas, the witness who lit a cigarette for the man, was never called upon to testify, because everyone who knew Walter claimed that he never smoked. Now, I know that when I first heard that Walter lived directly across the street from Barbara Jean's residence, it made total sense to me that he could have taken her from her front yard and killed her inside his house before placing her body inside a cardboard box and carrying it down the street a few hours later. But my outlook changed once I learned that Walter was sharing the house with a family at that time, and 2 of his housemates, Linda and Sarge Green, were actually at home during the time period he was supposedly killing Barbara Jean in the basement. Even after Walter was charged with the murder, they never wavered from their original story that they were there the entire afternoon and never witnessed Walter lure Barbara Jean into the house or saw or heard anything unusual. For years, Barbara's stepfather, John Fahey, always had his suspicions that her murder was somehow connected to that house, because even though she had become friends with the Green's son, Charlie Bird, her parents did not want her going over there, as the Greens often held wild, drug-fueled parties which were attended by bikers and other criminals. Sarge Green had a prior criminal history and a propensity for violence, whereas Walter had no criminal record, so on the surface, you would have assumed that Sarge seemed like a more probable candidate to be Barbara Jean's killer. But since he did not resemble the man with the TV box, Sarge was never considered to be a suspect, and given that he died of sepsis only a few years later, I'm sure his wife, children, or someone else would have spoken out if Sarge was involved in the crime. If Walter killed Barbara Jean, You could assume that perhaps the Greens helped cover for him, but they didn't even like Walter that much and had a major falling out with him in the months following the murder, which led to Sarge beating up Walter so badly that he had to be hospitalized and Sarge was served with a restraining order. Even when the Greens were re-interviewed by Devlin and Worrell in 1992, they continued to maintain that they never saw anything out of the ordinary in the house that afternoon, and Sarge even said that if Walter had harmed a child, he would have killed him himself. It's absurd enough to think that Walter could have committed murder in the basement and disposed of Barbara Jean's body without the Greens knowing about it, but we know that his original statement about sneaking her body through the basement's back door into the garage had to be false, since that door had been nailed and blocked shut years earlier. This meant that if Walter took Barbara Jean out of the house, he would have needed to carry her body upstairs into the living room and gone out the front door, but there's no way he could have pulled that off without the Greens seeing anything. Anyway, Walter had to go on trial twice before he was convicted, and I can't think of another case which provides a more vivid showcase of the sheer unpredictability of juries. Even though the world was not as well versed on the concept of false confessions back in 1993, the jury at Walter's first trial still became very skeptical that his confession was genuine, which is why they were about to find him not guilty. This is one of the most tragic aspects of this story, as Walter was literally within seconds of being spared 2 more decades in prison until one of the jurors, Alfred Shepchak, suddenly changed his mind, which led to a mistrial being declared. I honestly can't recall another trial where something like this happened, but it turned out that years earlier, Shepchak's son had been shot in a bar, and while he wound up surviving, the shooter wound up being acquitted at trial on a technicality. According to one of his fellow jurors, Shepchak was left so enraged that he made a vow that if he ever served on a jury, he would not let the defendant go free, which, if true, probably should have disqualified him from jury duty in the first place. The other jurors felt that Shepchak seemed way too biased against Walter, but they did manage to temporarily convince him to vote for an acquittal before he changed his mind again. I'm sure Shepchak legitimately felt that he was preventing a child killer from going free, but now that it's been established that Walter was innocent all along, his decision is all the more frustrating. As you can imagine, since Walter came so close to being acquitted, I'm sure the Commonwealth felt they needed to strengthen their case for a second trial, which is why they wound up presenting the testimony of a jailhouse informant, Jay Wolchansky. I'm sure you all know that jailhouse informants have been another major cause of numerous wrongful convictions, and their usage of their testimony should be taken as a sign of desperation that the prosecution doesn't have much of a case. I mean, I know that criminals can do stupid things, and Walter was not the most intelligent person in the world, but put yourself in his shoes. He came very close to being found not guilty at his first trial, so I'm sure he knew the case against him was very weak, and there was a good chance he'd be acquitted at his next trial. So why would Walter then decide to confess to murdering a child to some fellow inmates and give the prosecution more evidence to use against him? After all, given how hated child killers are in jail, it's not like admitting to this sort of thing would help Walter in any way. The thing with Wolchansky's testimony is that it actually weakened the credibility of the Commonwealth's case rather than improved it, because the confession Walter supposedly made to him contradicted the original confession he made to police when he was arrested. Instead of Walter murdering Barbara Jean in a fit of rage because she fought him off while he was sexually assaulting her, he now supposedly brainstormed a premeditated murder plot in which he planned to kill Barbara Jean and pin the crime on John so that he could marry Sharon because he was in love with her. I mean, if that was Walter's actual motive, why wouldn't he have said so during his original confession? Never mind the fact that even though Walter lived directly across the street from them, the Fahey's said they did not know him and had no recollections of any interactions together which would have led to Walter falling in love with Sharon. Wolchansky's account of Walter's confession also made less sense than the first one, as this time, Walter supposedly went to the trouble of carrying Barbara Jean's body down the street to hide it in some bushes before he went back to retrieve her body and put it inside the TV box and disposed of it again. It's highly unlikely that Walter could have transported Barbara Jean's body back and forth through the neighborhood multiple times in broad daylight without someone seeing him. Yet, even though the Commonwealth's case at the second trial had more holes than their case at the first trial, the jury only had to deliberate for 90 minutes before finding Walter guilty, so it's really terrifying to think that a person's life can hinge entirely on how well a certain group of 12 people will interpret the evidence. Following the trial, Assistant District Attorney Judy Rubino told the press that she was happy this jury reached the right verdict and referred to the previous jury as quote-unquote stupid, even though it's clear that the first jury had a better understanding of the concept of reasonable doubt. Walter had the same defense attorney, Mark Greenberg, at both trials, but Greenberg probably made a huge mistake when he did not allow Walter to testify at the second trial. Even though putting a defendant on the witness stand can be a risky proposition, Walter's testimony seemed to make an impression on the jury at the first trial, as they had a hard time believing that someone with his speaking style could have produced the 16-page confession which was supposedly transcribed by detectives. Getting back to the whole jailhouse informant issue, I also cannot recall another case where one jailhouse snitch fed a false story to another snitch in order to testify in his behalf, but that's what happened here with John Hall and Jay Wilchansky. I mentioned in our last episode that John Hall was such a prominent jailhouse informant that he earned the nickname the Monsignor because he seemed to hear more confessions than your average priest. Hall was such an habitual criminal that he would pretty much follow a constant cycle in which he would be arrested for a crime and then offer his services to police to testify in a number of cases in order to get his jail sentences suspended and reduced. But once he was released, he would inevitably reoffend, go right back to jail, and the whole cycle would repeat itself. Now, if prosecutors intentionally transfer informants to a facility in order to target certain inmates, the informant officially becomes an agent of the state, which means they are required to read a fellow inmate their Miranda rights before they take down a confession from them. So to give you an idea of how absurd things got with Hall, there was actually one case where he presented a prosecutor with a confession from a cellmate, which was attached to a signed document of the inmate waiving his Miranda rights, as well as a signed, notarized affidavit in which Hall claimed that he was not working with law enforcement and only wound up being placed in this inmate's cell and hearing his confession by pure chance. Hall was transferred to the Federal Detention Center and began interacting with Walter shortly after the Pennsylvania Superior Court ruled that Walter would stand trial for a second time, which seems like too much of a coincidence, and needless to say, Hall never produced any documentation of Walter waiving his Miranda rights. By the time Walter's trial began, Hall was already developing a notorious reputation as a jailhouse snitch, and Judy Rubino was planning to use him as a witness in another upcoming murder trial, which is why Hall decided to share the details of Walter's so-called confession with Jay Wilchansky in order for him to testify in his place. But Hall's involvement in his next trial turned out to be an unmitigated disaster. On the morning of November 2, 1995, a 26-year-old paralegal named Kimberly Ernest went out for a jog in Philadelphia's Fittler Square neighborhood, but her body was soon found in a stairwell, and it turned out she was raped, beaten, and strangled to death. A pair of small-time criminals named Herbert Hawk and Richard Wise were eventually brought in for interrogation, and after they each confessed to the crime, they were charged with Ernest's murder. But in what has become a recurring theme in this series of episodes, Hawk and Wise both recanted their confessions and claimed they were beaten by detectives until they reluctantly admitted to the murder. On the same morning Ernest was killed, Hawk and Wise had actually been about 40 miles away at the Court of Common Pleas of Buck County for a preliminary hearing on a theft charge, and the timeline seemed to make it impossible for them to have committed the murder. In addition, DNA taken from semen and hairs found on Ernest's body did not match either of the two suspects. Well, the only reason these guys became suspects in the first place was because John Hall was Herbert Hawk's stepfather and greatly disliked him, so he decided to orchestrate an elaborate revenge scheme in which he would falsely implicate Hawk and Wise in the murder. In fact, Hall even planned to have his wife visit a jeweler and make a forgery of an inscribed necklace which had been stolen from Ernest, and Hall would then plant it as evidence to frame his stepson. By the time Hawk and Wise went on trial in March of 1997, all these allegations about Hall had surfaced, and his reputation as a witness was seriously tainted. So when he took the stand to testify, Hall invoked his Fifth Amendment rights and declined to answer any questions to avoid self-incrimination. As a result, Hawk and Wise were both found not guilty of Kimberly Ernest's murder, and to this day, we still don't know who is actually responsible for killing her. So as you can imagine, there was a lot of serious misconduct taking place in Philadelphia law enforcement during the 1990s. Since Herbert Hawk and Richard Wise were acquitted, they managed to avoid becoming the victims of a wrongful conviction, but sadly, Walter Ogrod's story is not an anomaly. Like I mentioned earlier, the two detectives who put him away, Marty Devlin and Paul Worrell, have found themselves at the center of some other wrongful conviction cases. In fact, the next case I'm going to talk about took place around the same time Walter was arrested, and I'm sure you'll experience a feeling of déjà vu when you hear the details. On the evening of January the 24th, 1992, 25-year-old John Lewis and 18-year-old Efren Gonzalez were both gunned down near the corner of West Russell Street and North 7th Street. While Lewis was killed, Gonzalez managed to survive and told police he had been shot and robbed by a black man while attempting to sell him marijuana. An eyewitness named Denise Mitchell eventually picked out 26-year-old Willie Vesey from a photo lineup and identified him as the shooter, so on the morning of June the 9th, Vesey was picked up by police and then taken to the Roundhouse for interrogation. He would be questioned by, you guessed it, Detectives Devlin and Worrell, and much like with Walter Ogrod, the session was never videotaped or recorded. After 2 hours of interrogation, Vesey supposedly made a confession which was written out by Devlin, and once Vesey signed it, he was charged with first-degree murder, criminal conspiracy, and possession of an instrument of crime. But, surprise, surprise, Vesey immediately recanted his confession and claimed it had been coerced after the two detectives threatened him and slapped him in the face. Before he was taken into custody, Vesey had spent the night drinking, and he became so exhausted that he decided to tell the detectives what they wanted to hear. Vesey also seemed to have an airtight alibi, as time card records from the night of the murder showed that he was working at a restaurant 8 miles away. And surprisingly, Efren Gonzalez, the survivor of the shooting, was never asked to look at a photo lineup or identify Vesey, and he was not called upon to testify when Vesey went on trial in February of 1993. Instead, the primary evidence against Vesey would be his own confession and the eyewitness identification of Denise Mitchell, though it would later come out that she was nearly legally blind. Even though the jury deliberated for a total of 4 days, they ultimately found Vesey guilty on all charges, and he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Well, I mentioned in my last episode that when Larry Krasner was elected District Attorney of Philadelphia in 2017, he campaigned on a platform to reform elements of the criminal justice system and really wanted to clean up a lot of the corruption and misconduct which had taken over the city's law enforcement. That's why his office formed a conviction integrity unit to review the city's more controversial cases, and they have since overturned a number of wrongful convictions and exonerated nearly 50 people, including Walter Ogrod. Well, the Conviction Integrity Unit also reviewed Willie Vesey's conviction, and they reached the conclusion that it should be vacated as they felt his confession and Denise Mitchell's identification were unreliable, and that Vesey's alibi should have immediately cleared him as a suspect. In October of 2019, the charges against Vesey were officially dismissed, and he walked out of prison after serving 27 years for a crime he did not commit. To this day, the real shooter of John Lewis and Efren Gonzalez has never been identified, and after Vesey filed a federal civil rights lawsuit for his wrongful conviction, the city of Philadelphia eventually reached a settlement in which they awarded him $5 million in compensation. Of course, Walter Ogrod did the same thing following his release, and he was awarded $9.1 million in compensation, which at the time was the third highest wrongful conviction settlement in the history of Philadelphia. Well, I suppose now would be an appropriate time to talk about the case with the highest wrongful conviction settlement in the city's history. Not only does it involve our old friend Marty Devlin, but this one has actually gotten him into serious legal trouble. On October the 19th, 1991, 77-year-old Louise Talley was raped and stabbed to death inside her house in Philadelphia's Nicetown neighborhood during an apparent burglary. Ronald St. James and John Richardson, a pair of drug dealers who lived nearby, were soon caught trying to sell Talley's stolen television set, and when questioned by police, they implicated a 20-year-old suspect named Anthony Wright, alleging that he committed the crime and brought them the TV to sell on his behalf. Wright was subsequently brought to the roundhouse and interrogated by Devlin and two other detectives, Manuel Santiago and Frank Yastrzemski, and once again, within 2 hours, Wright signed a 9-page typed statement in which he confessed to raping and murdering Talley during a burglary. He was charged with capital murder, rape, robbery, burglary, theft, and weapons violations, and after detectives performed a search of Wright's residence, they discovered a blood-stained pair of jeans and sweatshirt for the Chicago Bulls basketball team inside his room. Of course, Wright recanted his confession and denied any involvement in the crime, claiming that he only signed the detective's statement after they threatened to physically assault him. When Wright went on trial in May of 1993, a crime lab analyst testified that the blood found on the jeans and sweatshirt matched the victim's blood type. He also confirmed that some semen found on the jeans could have belonged to Wright, though DNA testing was not performed at that time. However, both Wright and his mother denied that this clothing belonged to him and claimed he had never even owned a Chicago Bulls sweatshirt. In fact, Wright's mother claimed that when detectives performed a search of his bedroom, the only clothing she saw them take was a white jumpsuit. In spite of this, the jury found Wright guilty of all charges and sentenced him to life imprisonment without parole. Well, in 2013, DNA testing was finally performed on the jeans and the sweatshirt, and it turned up no traces of Wright's DNA. In fact, Louise Talley's DNA was found inside both items of clothing, which seemed to indicate that she had previously worn them and the clothes actually belonged to her. So in essence, it appeared that detectives had taken Talley's blood-stained clothing and pretended to have found it in Wright's bedroom so they could pass it off as his. Additional testing was performed on Talley's rape kit, and it managed to turn up a male DNA profile which matched a convicted criminal named Ronnie Bird. Bird was a former crack dealer who lived in the Nicetown neighborhood back in 1991, though he had recently died in a South Carolina prison while serving time for another crime. In addition, Ronald St. James and John Richardson, the two drug dealers who implicated Wright, were former friends of Ronnie Bird and may have attempted to direct suspicion away from him by pointing the finger at an innocent man. Upon receiving this new evidence, the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office agreed to vacate Wright's conviction, but surprisingly, they did not drop the charges against him. Instead, they elected to bring Wright to trial again and attempted to explain away the presence of Ronnie Bird's DNA by presenting an all-new scenario where Bird and Wright committed the crime together, but Bird was the only one who raped Louise Talley. By the time Wright's second trial began in August of 2016, Bird, Ronald St. James, and John Richardson were all deceased, so they could not be cross-examined as witnesses. Regardless, the jury did not buy the prosecution's theory that Wright helped Bird commit the murder, so they found him not guilty on all charges, and he was finally released from prison after serving nearly 25 years. And of course, Wright soon filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against the city of Philadelphia and the Philadelphia Police Department, and in June of 2018, a settlement was reached in which Wright was awarded $9.85 million in compensation for his wrongful conviction. By this point, Detectives Devlin, Santiago, and Yastrzemski had all retired, but this is the third case I've discussed in which Devlin has been accused of coercing a false confession from an innocent suspect in order to send them for prison for a crime they did not commit. I mentioned in our last episode that while he was active, Devlin had earned the nickname Detective Perfect because he had an abnormally high clearance rate and seemed to have a gift for closing cases by obtaining confessions. But we now know that this was because a good chunk of these confessions were bogus. In a lot of these wrongful conviction cases, the responsible police officers never face any consequences for their actions, but in August of 2021, a grand jury indicted Devlin, Santiago, and Yastrzemski for perjury for their actions in Anthony Wright's case. Devlin and Santiago have been accused of lying about obtaining a false confession from Wright, while Yastrzemski allegedly lied under oath about having found blood-stained clothing in Wright's bedroom when the items actually belonged to Louise Talley. It was reported that all three of them were scheduled to go on trial in November of 2024, but as far as I can tell, the trial was postponed, and at the time of this recording, it is yet to take place. Even though these guys are now in their 70s, it's clear that Larry Krasner and the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office want to send a message that police misconduct in these wrongful conviction cases is no longer being tolerated and there will be consequences. It's a sharp contrast to Krasner's predecessor, who, even after the DNA testing cleared Anthony Wright, still refused to acknowledge that the authorities made a mistake and instead attempted to bring Wright to trial again with a far-fetched theory about him being Ronnie Byrd's accomplice. I could probably do an entire long-form podcast series about the corruption, misconduct, and wrongful convictions which have taken place in Philadelphia these past several decades, but it's clear that what happened to Walter Ogrod was not an isolated incident. So getting back to this case, now that Walter is a free man again and has been fully exonerated, the rest of this episode will be devoted to figuring out who actually killed Barbara Jean Horn. Sharon Fahey has publicly stated that she believes Walter was wrongly convicted, and while John Fahey seems less certain about Walter's innocence, it sounds like they are both willing to keep an open mind and hold out hope that Barbara Jean's real killer will eventually be brought to justice. Now, during the early stages of the investigation, John Fahey was looked at as a potential suspect, and it's not hard to imagine why, considering that Barbara Jean went missing from the front yard, and by his own admission, John let her play outside for about an hour before he went to check on her. By today's standards, it might seem odd that John would allow a 4-year-old to be unsupervised for that long, but you have to remember that 1988 was just a much different time, and it's because of cases like this that parents have become more protective of their children. John was definitely a flawed individual who drank too much and was physically abusive towards his wife on a few occasions, but everyone who knew him, including Sharon, believed that even though John was not Barbara's biological father, he truly loved her and never would have done anything to harm her. Of course, it's clear that John was definitely not the man seen carrying the cardboard TV box with Barbara Jean's body, but that didn't stop Devlin and Morrell from accusing him of the crime when they took over the investigation years later, as well as accusing Sharon of covering for him. Given their history of racking up false confessions, it's now clear that the two detectives would have been fine with charging John with the crime if he or Sharon had broken down and admitted to their complicity. Now, while the eyewitness sightings of the man with the TV box have been heavily discussed, one sighting which often seems to get forgotten was from Margaret Cruz, who said she saw a man in a navy blue t-shirt and work pants leading Barbara Jean away from her front yard by the elbow sometime after 3 p.m. that afternoon. Cruz didn't get a good enough look at this man's face to identify him or provide much of a description, but her story was pretty much disregarded after Walter was arrested. She was never called upon to testify at either of Walter's trials, probably because her account completely went against the narrative that Barbara Jean walked across the street and knocked on the front door of Walter's house before she was lured inside. If Cruz's account is accurate, then she likely got a look at Barbara Jean's killer, but we just don't know his identity or where he took Barbara Jean during the 2-hour window before her body was found. It's possible the perpetrator had no personal connection to Barbara Jean and decided to abduct her at random because he was passing through the neighborhood and just happened to see her playing alone unsupervised in her front yard. To recap, Barbara Jean was last confirmed to be alive shortly after 3 p.m., the man was first seen carrying the box shortly after 5 p.m., and Barbara Jean's estimated time of death was believed to be sometime between 3:30 and 4:30. Since the TV box was found less than 1,000 feet away from Barbara Jean's house, the tight timeline suggests that the killer was a local resident who lived in the neighborhood or the surrounding area and took Barbara Jean into one of the houses in order to kill her. I consider the possibility that Barbara Jean could have been killed inside a parked vehicle or a nearby wooded area or something, but since her hair was wet and it seems likely that the killer washed her body, I believe she had to have been inside a residence at some point. David Schechtman, the witness who conversed with the man carrying the box, said he mentioned something about trash collection taking place on Wednesdays on that particular street, which suggested that he might have had some knowledge of the area. If the killer did live in Castro Gardens, I'd be curious to know if any local residents moved away after the murder took place, or even had guests staying with them who left a short time later. If the perpetrator was a local, it's all the more astonishing that all these witnesses saw him and none of them were able to make a positive identification. Was there no one living in Castor Gardens at that time who matched the killer's description or resembled the composite sketch? Yes, a few potential suspects were tentatively identified by eyewitnesses, but no corroborating evidence was found against any of them. If the killer was living in the area at the time, I wonder if he was either a very reclusive person who did not interact with his neighbors that much, or he left the area shortly after the crime took place and was never investigated. This case is actually very reminiscent of the most famous child murder in the history of Philadelphia, and that's the boy in the box case. In case you're not familiar with this story, it involved the nude body of a murdered young boy being found inside a cardboard box left in a wooded area in February of 1957, and it would be 65 years before DNA testing finally identified the victim as 4-year-old Joseph Augustus Sorelli. Much like Barbara Jean, even though Joseph had been physically abused, he appeared to have been cleaned and freshly groomed by his killer before they disposed of his body. While Joseph's murder is still officially unsolved, there's been a lot of speculation that he was murdered by a family member or caregiver. But here, Barbara Jean was abducted, murdered, and cleaned by someone who only had her for about 2 hours before placing her inside a box and disposing of her. And another key difference is that instead of dumping the box in a remote wooded area, Barbara Jean's killer was brazen enough to carry the box through the neighborhood in broad daylight in front of witnesses who said that he didn't make much of an attempt to hide his face. This makes me think that the killer did not own a vehicle or had access to one, because otherwise it would have made much more sense for him to drive Barbara Jean's body to a faraway location in order to get rid of it. He probably figured that once Barbara Jean was reported missing, the police might perform a house-to-house search of the neighborhood, so he felt that he needed to get her body out of his residence as soon as possible, and the only way to do so would be to conceal it inside a box and carry it down the street to abandon it. Even though Barbara Jean was found nude, there was no sign of sexual penetration and no sperm was found on her body, though I suppose physical evidence could have been eliminated when her body was washed. But in recent years, at least one expert has offered his opinion that the so-called bruises found on Barbara Jean's body were actually hickeys caused by biting or sucking on her skin, so the crime still might have been sexually motivated. Of course, the issue was that there was no mention of anything involving hickeys in Walter's confessions, even though he said he tried to sexually assault her. Well, at Walter's first trial, the prosecution tried to allege that a single sperm cell with no tail was found in a spot of Barbara Jean's saliva inside the box. But when the Conviction Integrity Unit re-examined this evidence years later, they concluded that the so-called sperm was actually a small trace of cat urine, which would make sense, since the TV box originated from a home owned by a family who had a pet cat. Since she had lacerations on her scalp, Barbara Jean was likely struck by something, though the consensus now seems to be that her cause of death was asphyxiation. Unfortunately, there really doesn't seem to be much in the way of DNA evidence to work with. For years, Walter's defense team were hoping to perform new testing on Barbara Jean's fingernail scrapings, but even though this new testing was granted, nothing about the fingernail scrapings has been mentioned in the Conviction Integrity Unit's expert reports, so I'm guessing that the results may have been inconclusive. But it appears that a full male DNA profile was recovered from a sample of body wash recovered from Barbara Jean's autopsy, which excluded Walter and is yet to be matched with anyone. This DNA profile has been entered into some national databases, such as CODIS, but it's unclear if and when any attempt might be made to perform forensic genealogy, which has led to the resolution of so many cold cases these past several years. During the original investigation, at least 3 potential suspects popped up on the radar, and I'm not sure if any of them have officially been ruled out. Of course, one of them was Wesley Ward, whose parents had purchased the TV from the box used to conceal Barbara Jean's body and kept the box inside their basement. Now, I ordinarily wouldn't think that a killer would be stupid enough to dispose of their victim's body inside a box which could be traced back to them, but criminals have been caught doing stupider things than that. Ward claimed that he took the box out of the basement and decided to leave it on the curb for trash collection on the same afternoon the murder took place, which might seem like too much of a coincidence, considering that his family had held on to that box for around 4 years. But at the same time, if the killer lived nearby and needed something to transport Barbara Jean's body, then I could see them searching around the neighborhood and taking the empty box from the curb. We know that Ward's parents were out of town, and his alibi about being in class that afternoon could not be substantiated, but at the same time, no evidence could be found in the Ward residence to suggest that a crime took place. While I've never seen any photographs of Ward, it's been reported that he didn't look anything like the composite sketch of the suspect, and as far as I can tell, there was nothing in his background to suggest he might be a child murderer. Now, Ross Felice, the other person of interest from the early stages of the investigation, apparently did look like the sketch, though once again, I have been unable to find any photographs of Felice to confirm this myself. But he apparently garnered suspicion by frantically asking people in the neighborhood about how much the police knew during the hours following the discovery of Barbara Jean's body. Much like Ward, no physical evidence could be found to link Felice to the crime, and I have not heard about him having a criminal history or anything in his background to suggest he was capable of killing a child. And this whole situation once again demonstrates the fallibility of eyewitness identification. As you recall, there was one occasion when detectives took David Schechtman to a gym to have a look at Felice, and he said he was absolutely certain that this was the same man he saw carrying the box, and 2 of the other witnesses also identified Felice as well. Under normal circumstances, you might think this was strong enough evidence to make an arrest, but the problem is that Schechtman's identification took place 6 months after the fact when his memory no longer would have been fresh. In addition, he had already previously identified Raymond Sheehan and Ross's brother, Michael Felice, as the man carrying the box. Remember, Schechtman actually came face to face with this man and conversed with him for about 11 minutes, so you would think you'd be able to put more stock into his account than any of the other witnesses. But he could not keep his identifications consistent, which only shows that if you want to use eyewitness testimony to make a case against a suspect, you need other corroborating evidence. Another point in favor of Felice and Ward's innocence is that a fingerprint was found on both the TV box and the trash bag used to conceal Barbara Jean's body, and they did not match either of these 2 men. I've actually wondered if the print on the box might not have any significance, since it had been in the Ward family's possession for years, so for all we know, it could have been left there long before the murder. It's also never been made clear to me if the prints found on the box and the trash bag match each other and belong to the same person, but if they do, then I think that indicates they belong to the killer. I know that when Felice and Ward's respective residences were searched, they each contained trash bags which were not similar to the one wrapped around Barbara Jean's body. While I'm not sure if the male DNA profile from the body watch was ever compared to Felice or Ward, I am inclined to believe that neither of them is the killer. Now, Raymond Sheehan, on the other hand, he definitely seems like a compelling suspect, since we know he's a convicted child killer who is currently serving a life sentence for the murder of 10-year-old Heather Coffin, which took place the year before Barbara Jean was killed at a residence only about a mile away. The only photographs I've seen of Sheehan were taken after he was charged with the crime in 2003, but while I'm not sure if he looked the same 15 years earlier, Sheehan was described as being a short man, and the guy seen carrying the box was described as being between 5'6" and 5'8". But the fingerprint from the box did not match Sheehan either, and while I have not specifically heard anything about a DNA comparison being made, Sheehan is a convicted murderer, so I'm sure his DNA would be in the system. While no one has ever officially confirmed if Sheehan has been ruled out as a suspect, my gut tells me that he may have been, because if there was a DNA match, I'm sure Sheehan would have been charged in this murder a long time ago. In spite of the close proximity of the crimes, there are actually substantial differences between the murders of Barbara Jean Horn and Heather Coffin, as Heather was the victim of a home invasion rather than an abduction. Sheehan was also a former employee of Heather's father, Randall Coffin, and when he confessed to the murder, he claimed that he originally broke into the Coffin residence for the purpose of stealing money that he felt Randall owed him. But Sheehan accidentally knocked over a lamp, which woke up Heather, and since she recognized him, Sheehan proceeded to rape and strangle her to death while in what he described as a quote-unquote drug-induced haze. Sheehan has always denied any involvement in Barbara Jean's murder, but regardless of whether you believe him or not, you can't deny that the circumstances of how Heather were killed are quite different, and since Sheehan has no record of any other crimes besides this one, he doesn't seem to be a serial child predator. So overall, I would not be surprised if it turned out that Barbara Jean's real killer is someone who has yet to pop up on the radar as a potential suspect. I've already said this numerous times, but given the short time frame and the limited number of people who would have had the opportunity to commit this murder, this really does seem like a very solvable case even after all this time. Since over 36 years have passed, it's possible that the killer is already dead, but even if they are never charged, DNA testing and forensic genealogy could posthumously link them to the crime. Regardless of whether or not the real killer is actually caught, at least Walter Ogrod has been exonerated, but even a $9 million payout is not adequate compensation for spending 28 years behind bars for a crime you did not commit, to say nothing of coming dangerously close to being executed. I am glad that Walter has offered to use some of his settlement money to hire a private investigator to help the Fahey's solve this case, because John and Sharon have been through pure hell as they were made to believe that Barbara Jean's killer had been caught, only to learn that the wrong man was convicted and they would essentially have to start all over again. After going through this ordeal for over 36 years, the Faheys deserve conclusive answers, and Barbara Jean finally deserves true justice. So if you happen to have any information about the murder of Barbara Jean Horn, please contact the Philadelphia Police Department's tip line at 215-686-TIPS. That's 215-686-8477. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the course of nearly 7 years, our Patreon page has released around 80 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released an episode about the death of Joyce Meyer Somers, a woman who was found dead in a cemetery shortly before Christmas in 1996 and remained a Jane Doe for nearly 26 years before she was identified. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and one of my co-hosts, Jules, discuss a final appeal case from Unsolved Mysteries, the controversial 1979 conviction of Michael Scott Martin. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have 70 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Chandra A., Olivia S., and Quinn M. Thank you all so much for your support. I'd also like to remind everyone that just over 2 months from now, The Trail Went Cold will be appearing at a new event called AdvocacyCon, which is taking place from March the 28th to the 30th at the Indianapolis Marriott East Hotel in Indianapolis, Indiana. It's being put together by fellow true crime podcasters Eric from True Consequences and Melissa and Whitney from Navigating Advocacy, and is intended as a platform for the families of missing and murdered victims. We have a specialized promo code you can use to get a discount on tickets, so if you would like to attend, please visit their website, advocacycon.com, and use the code TRAIL10 to get 10% off. Once again, the website is advocacycon.com, and the promo code is TRAIL10 for 10% off tickets. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composed the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, or whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. So have yourselves a great week, and be sure to join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.